The Spin-Off Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Gree tōku ingoa. My guest today is Amie Mills, who is the head of funding at New Zealand On Air, and someone I've talked to a lot over the years. Like there's just a few like hardcore geeks in this business, and I mean that in the broader sense of the word, in the media, who are really interested in the knottiest conversations around where audiences are going, how they're behaving, how you optimally create things that, you know, achieve public media type outcomes in a very fast changing environment. That conversation is not for everyone, man. I see people's eyes darting around when I start talking like that, and I'm like, yep, fair play to you. But if that's what you're into, then honestly, you've come to the right place today. What we're talking about is two things, both of which are very fresh and people will just be digesting over the coming weeks and months. The first is a brand new batch of research called Where Are the Youth Audiences? Might be youth, might be young, but there's a Y in there. And that's a sort of an offspring of Where Are the Audiences, which is this relatively long-running piece of research that New Zealand On Air has conducted that is about the changing habits of viewing. You know, for listeners to this podcast will know for many decades we basically got up and did the same thing, read the newspaper, listened to the radio, watched television in the evenings. We were feeling really frisky, we might read a magazine. And then the internet comes along and blows that whole thing up. And what Where Are the Audiences has done is sort of track that from 2014, relatively late in the piece, where you could really see particularly younger people gravitating towards the internet. You know, we had, you know, the iPhone was maybe 5-6 years old. Ultra-fast broadband was maybe 5 or 6 years old. You know, it was just the birth of the modern communications infrastructure, information infrastructure environment. And over the 8 years subsequent to that, everything's changed incredibly fast. And New Zealand On Air is our sort of decentralized public media funder, has had to kind of go along with that. Sometimes, you know, often it's been a little bit, you know, back of the cut, but ultimately, I think, particularly over the last few years, it's really made a very good faith effort to try and get up to speed with that. And, you know, that's particularly been true over the last couple of years since Cam Harlan took over as CE and Amie as head of funding. So as if that wasn't enough, just as a general backdrop, over the last couple of years, the government has decided that it's going to merge RNZ and TVNZ, two venerable, been around decades, parts of our public media infrastructure. God, this sounds boring, but it's not. And then give them a bunch more money and say, go and get those audiences that you missed. Oh, and by the way, some of that money that we're giving you, we used to give to New Zealand On Air. Sorry, New Zealand On Air, you don't have that money anymore. So New Zealand On Air, which has done this important, complex, increasingly complex job, suddenly has to figure out how to do it with heaps less money. And so that's what the second part of the interview is about, this new strategy, how they try and figure out how to be in a world where someone else has their mandate and someone else has way more money than them. And, there's a version of that where you just want to, pack up your toys and leave, and I'm sure they had days like that. But I think what they've arrived at, this idea of them being about research and about development and just creating an atmosphere that will let a lot more different kinds of people create work for audiences, and thinking really broadly about that, about almost like a venture capitalist is how I've written about it. That's interesting. Whether it'll work, no one knows. That's not how any of this works. As anyone who tells you something with any confidence just has got, they can't possibly be correct, because the whole nature of this era is of things changing all the time in ways that no one could possibly anticipate. So Amie is one of my favorite people to talk about it. She's very smart. She's very much about good faith. She's not at all interested in, the sort of perpetuating the way things are, but equally, will not just accept that just because, someone says they have a particular audience or solution, she won't take that at face value. She'll probe it as to why. And so hopefully this conversation kind of leans into all of the complexity of that, but still gets us somewhere good. So this is Amie Mills, New Zealand On Air's Head of Funding, on The Fold. Tēnā koe, Amie Mills. I'm so excited to have you on The Fold.
Kia ora, Duncan.
That's largely because we talk a lot, and when we do, it always feels like it's basically a fold with no microphones. But we're going to talk about two things today. We're going to talk about where are the young audiences, which is a piece of research that came out literally this morning, and the new strategy, which is something that came out last week. So it's all very fresh.
It's all happening.
It is all happening. It's not a chill time of year. But what I wanted to start with is actually something that's a lot more basic than that, which is just explain to our listeners what New Zealand On Air is and what your role in that kind of beautiful unicorn of an organisation is.
I've actually never heard anyone describe a public media funding agency as a beautiful unicorn, but it feels like that to me. So so as I understand it, actually the genesis of the whole New Zealand On Air model actually came from Richard Prebble. So it has a very interesting kind of foundation to it, which is around kind of almost this idea of greater contestability.
So tell me why you wanted to work there.
So the journey to figuring out what New Zealand On Air was kind of a circuitous one, and I'd started at TVNZ in the marketing team originally, and had been working on how to build out almost kind of, we don't use the word anymore, but like transmedia, multi-platform campaigns around the local content that TVNZ was commissioning, funded by New Zealand On Air, but in the marketing team I sort of wasn't fully aware of that. And then when I jumped across and became the Digital and Children's Commissioner, suddenly I can completely understand and see the role of New Zealand On Air. And that was actually my tethering to it, was that at the time, and it's kind of apt actually that we're going to be talking about the youth research, but New Zealand On Air had done this very significant deep dive into children's media use, which led them to putting out quite a specialised and bespoke kind of request into the market to say we want a partner who will create a children's platform for us, because actually the research is showing this is what we need to do in this particular moment in time. And so when I was at TVNZ, we pitched for that work and worked incredibly closely alongside New Zealand On Air to develop what was the Hey Hey platform when it was launched. And that made me understand the role of New Zealand On Air, and that's when I kind of fell in love with what we do and the importance of it and how protected it was. And I think I'd been working quite a few years within TVNZ, and we'd been making amazing local content, but I could also see how difficult it was to get what I would call kind of pure public media content up and out into the world, particularly things like children's content where it's not easily or not at all commercialised. And so, that was the sort of burgeoning understanding of New Zealand On Air, and then the rare role came up for the head of funding, so I just chucked my head in.
It's such a... I feel like that because there is a dominant model for public media around the world, particularly in countries to which we have close ties. That's the ABC, the CBC, the BBC, Australia, Canada, and Britain. But the the New Zealand approach, it's really different, but it feels kind of suited to a country like ours, which is, it's got all these attributes that really aren't common to others, and and I think that's interesting. Well, hopefully we'll get into that, but I guess the thing that's about that makes it controversial is also, in some respects, what makes this research actually really important, because there's this sense that when you have a single source of truth, like a single supplier of public media, you want to know whether something's successful, but on some level, it's a nice to know. Like, it helps, kind of explain your mandate. But when it's contestable, you really need to know what people are doing with their attention and how that relates to what you're funding. And this is quite controversial research, and we'll get into that. But I wondered if you could just sort of explain why, and this actually predates you, the original Waiata research, but explain why New Zealand On Air kind of started doing this research and what it is that it's become for the organisation over the years.
I mean, it's become absolutely central to how we undertake our kind of approaches to our funding strategies, because ultimately our true north, we talk about all the time, is the underrepresented audiences that sit within the Broadcasting Act, which underpins us, which was created 30 years ago. And those are the audiences that are often most underrepresented, underserved, arguably overlooked by the commercial media, the mainstream media. And so this research is the kind of the underpinning, if you like, of better understanding those audience groups so that we can better serve them. I think you've said this multiple times in your kind of assessment of the research. There's also something I think we hold very close, which is we're an agnostic horse in this race. We aren't attached to a platform, and therefore that data around audiences, I think, is all the more kind of weightier because it has a level of, I would say, objectivity to it, because actually we're not. You know what it's like when you get data from every platform will cut the same data completely different ways to tell the story they need it to tell. So there's something quite powerful, I think, about what that research signifies within the sector on the basis of us sort of sitting as Switzerland in terms of putting it out. But increasingly, I think we're now trying to utilise the research, and we'll talk about this more with the youth one, to sort of reimagine the funding policies, which we probably have done less of. We've kind of steered or tried to prioritise how we fund things still using the same traditional platforms and partnerships that we've had in place. And I think now we're starting to lean deeper into the research to go, do the models need to be upturned? Yeah.
So that kind of talks to that new strategy that you announced at Sparta a few days ago, which I think we'll get to. But in some ways, where are the youth audiences research, which came up this morning, really almost gives you like a fresh and quite powerful mandate around there is no choice but to change. What leapt out of these findings to you?
I'm going to put a really positive spin on it, which I know you will then challenge. But the things that leapt out to me, and I guess this is because this is the world in which I'm doing a lot of thinking, but it was actually the conversations with the young people around perceptions of the quality of the content and why they watch the content, the motivations for doing it. Like, I think I think there's been a bit of a not a myth, but just the sense to which we talk about New Zealand-specific local content, young people not being interested in it, or there's cultural cringe, or it's not good enough quality and they don't want to watch it, they want to watch Netflix or they want to watch HBO. The powerful kind of insights out of this research that I am leaning into is that actually when we put local content in front of them, they were overwhelmingly positive about the content itself and surprised by it and kind of debunking their own perceptions around quality when they had it. So, but then that highlights obviously the undeniable fact of discoverability and actually getting it in front of them so that they can consume it. But I guess it felt very heartening to know that it's not the content itself, that actually when young people are engaging with content that reflects New Zealandness, reflects them back at themselves, they want that, they want more of that, they want content that they know, speaks to them.
Yeah, and I am gonna push back a little, only in the sense that I think that can be true in the abstract, but the whole lesson of the last 10 years is when given the option, people at the top level tend to behave in a particular way, and the part I found most staggering about this was that of the top 7 platforms by daily usage, and this is complicated, right? Because this actually, you can watch video on all of these platforms, but they're also messaging platforms and photo sharing platforms. They do a whole bunch of things, but all 7 of them are from overseas and driven by algorithms, essentially, and which means that ultimately the discoverability piece is in someone else's hands, unless a really, really brave politician wants to challenge that and start to get involved in how content is surfaced, which people are doing overseas, and I think on some level is almost inevitable here. But the fact that those are they're algorithmically driven, they're overseas owned. They're also largely user-generated content as opposed to the professionally made content that we as in our industries, New Zealand On Air funds and the spin-off tends to cover. That's really not the thing. Like, how do you sort of respond to that? Do you think that is a bit of a wero to New Zealand On Air to actually think, how do we engage with that user-generated content world, or is it actually that it's about taking what is created out of the production sector and adapting it for those platforms?
Yeah, I think what's interesting in this particular conversation is not to lump all content in together, because I think what the research talked about a little bit, and there's probably a deeper dive that can be done in this space, is that young people still actually are demonstrating desire to watch similar types of what we might call kind of traditional content genres, or kind of, scripted or drama, or, something like Heartbreak High on Netflix, which, you and I have talked a little bit about. And so I think what we're kind of interested in is that it's not one way in which the content needs to be made, or one type of genre, it's understanding what are their motivations for watching, where do we need to be investing more in that more UGC type content that you're talking about, but actually where is it still entirely relevant to be making a youth drama, for example, but then being incredibly smart about how that content then can be kind of deconstructed, or not just deconstructed, but actually kind of built and assets created in such a way that it lives and breathes on TikTok, or it lives and breathes on YouTube, and maybe draws a whole kind of attention and currency and conversation, but ultimately they're watching that show on Netflix, or they're watching it on TVNZ Plus or wherever. So I think it's a very significant challenge, but I just don't see us making one kind of type of content or having to change our approach to only do it one certain way for this audience group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's and also, I think you can't deny the fact that we're in a state of transition, and that none of this stuff is resolved just yet. But another stat that leapt out to me that was quite alarming was the idea that less than half of our rangatahi can say with any confidence that they have consumed a piece of New Zealand-made content, setting aside music, which I want to talk about separately because I do think it's instructive, in the past month. Which it's something that we have to wrestle with. Like the beautiful thing about this research is I think we have to look at it. We can't dismiss it, even though some people would like to.
And just on that point in particular, like I do think it would be interesting for us to think more about. Does it matter that they don't identify it as New Zealand content or think of it as local content per se? Like there might be more stock we're placing in the labelling of something as local when actually they just want to love the content they love, and they want it to be surfaced where they are, and they want to be able to talk about it with their friends. And whether or not they consciously or specifically go, that's a piece of local content. Like, I think we're quite hung up on that, especially in that government funding space where we're trying to talk about the outcomes.
agree.
I think the measures around cultural impact are far more important. Like, what we don't want to be seeing is we want to be able to say, did this content make you feel differently about being in New Zealand, or how did it make you feel about the country and that you live in and things? Like, those are the measures that are going to matter. There's something in, the labelling of it that I'm like struggling with a little bit as well.
I understand that, and I do think, it's totally plausible that, a 20-year-old from New Zealand might only view, and as in watch through or having meaningful engagement with a piece of New Zealand content twice a year, and that might be actually a perfectly acceptable amount, and that wouldn't be captured within that, what looks like a satisfactory measure within this survey. But it also feels like on some level it gives you a bit of an out to say, maybe they didn't know that it was New Zealand content. Because I think obviously within a, UGC, the user-generated content world, they will be seeing New Zealand-made stuff all the time. It might just be made by their friends. It might be just, like a creator economy / influencer, delete according to taste, person who they've always admired, both of which are currently unfunded, unfundable, but setting that aside. But I do think, that's why the stuff is so challenging, right? But
and I think your point is right that you put up in the article around saying that these conversations moving forward, we have to be talking about YouTube and Netflix and others. But I think that you're absolutely right. So the conversation will shift, because at the moment there is such a scarcity of any content, local content being put out on those platforms, that it's no wonder that that's the kind of response. So I guess it's just looking at the opportunity of that moving forward for us is what we're really interested in, because I think we can see where, especially with all the changes which we'll talk about, but where it'll be far more natural for us to be funding directly to those platforms, with a few caveats in place around how that's done. And I keep thinking as well, for us, it's about investing in the storytellers who are of that, not just age demographic, but of that mindset. And like, the more we are building the skills and capability of people who want to be telling stories for those audiences, the better this outlook is going to be.
I mean, that was the thing that struck me at the SPARTA conference last Friday was, you had a whole room full of people who are used to operating in a system that is basically descended from how things were made for linear television, which is that you spend a lot of time planning, that you pitch a particular way. There's a whole sort of schedule to it that is functionally kind of the opposite of the way that the UGC universe operates. And I guess this is where ultimately I'm leading to. Like, is there and I know that there has been, New Zealand On Air, to I think its credit, has worked with TikTok, has worked with YouTube Kids, for example, and is very open to those platforms. But it still feels on some level like it comes from a place of the idea, the pitch, like it's just got a particular gestation to it, whereas there's a world where you take people who have proven an ability to go and find an audience, but who operate in a very responsive way that's responsive to events, to trends. I mean, that's very much what TikTok is about. And you don't know exactly what you're going to get, but there's a bit of a trust me quality to it. Do you think that is something that you can imagine for New Zealand On Air particularly, and we'll get to that, this new vision of New Zealand On Air, which has just quite a different remit post ANZPM?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think you kind of gave a nod to this. We've already got the toe in the water on it, and something like Shit You Should Care About's Extremely Online, which was born out of the youth RFP, the request for proposals that we put out, which we kind of changed the rules on for that very reason. So I think we keep talking almost sort of ad nauseum in the scripted space about the power of development funding, that actually projects can kind of come in for initial seed funding to develop, to find their concept and then develop, and then come in for further production funding. And I think that there's even more that can be done around responsive access to funding or slate funding, so that you have, so let's say like a creator like Robbie Nicol, who's making through and through incredible public media content. And yet him and I have had really interesting conversations in the past about how, exactly as you're saying, the funding mechanisms have almost thwarted the ability for that content to live and breathe the way it needs to on YouTube because of those kind of structures, or because the scale of production has shifted in such a way. So I think that's going to be core to how we move forward to reach these audiences, is that we will be funding the content in ways that work for how content creators are doing it on those platforms now. But then I'd be at pains to also say, but we've got to be doing it for the right type of content that justifies public subsidy and is public media content. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And it's also the hard thing, because on some level, the way that things are currently structured allows you to vet at a reasonably granular level what it is you are buying. Whereas this flipping of that says you can vet who you're buying, but you can't have much control or have anywhere near as much control over what it is they make.
But we don't at the moment. We have no editorial remit across the content. But you're right in terms of the way things are pitched and how structured they are.
How much detail there is in those pitches.
Yeah, precisely. But again, I think all that stuff actually boringly comes down to kind of mechanisms that you build into your production funding agreements, or how you might have executive producer oversight, or we have reporting requirements currently where producers have to kind of be able to get the drawdowns of the funding. They have to be talking about how they're delivering to what they pitched. And so there's all kinds of mechanisms, I think, that you can safeguard around that.
Yeah, doesn't it all feel like it's incompatible? It requires a change of philosophy. But the big thing, you're in a room like that, and I want to move on because it can get so in the weeds. And this is a bit of a trade podcast, I'm not going to lie, but it can be too much so at times. But that
you don't want to talk more about funding policy?
I mean, that I can do that all day. But that this thing exists ultimately for audiences. It doesn't exist for the production sector. The production sector is just something that's grown up around serving those audiences, and the production sector is going to have to change if it wants to pursue particularly those audiences. And it's also going to have to understand that it's going to compete with solo creators and little groups of creators in a way that's really would have been totally unimaginable even a few years ago. One thing I thought there was, my turn to find a bright spot in the research was the extent to which New Zealand music really kind of shone within it. And that is, New Zealand music it gets about $6 million of New Zealand On Air's budget, which, roughly 4%, a tiny fragment in the scheme of things. And yet it's overall, across almost every metric you cared to name, it did well within the research around kind of recognition, frequency of engagement, and so on. And there was part of me that sort of thought, well, music's always been a bit of a user-generated content, right? Like it doesn't come through the same kind of pipe system. There are always new people trying to fight their way into the arena. There are a bunch of different labels. Anyone can upload a song to Spotify. Anyone can upload a song to YouTube. Were there lessons that you felt that music knows that we can, the broader screen or content industry can learn from? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think hats off to music as well, because they overcame a kind of cultural cringe. So they've actually done the job of moving past 100%. The perceptions of that in terms of quality, especially on the global stage. And I think we talk a lot internally about some of the key differentiators between music funding and screen funding, things like actually long ago the openness towards that content going out onto international platforms, and things like marketing and promotion. And actually I've always really admired and loved the showcase model as well within music, where kind of musicians are brought through, especially emerging musicians, and can showcase their work, and then that kind of builds trajectory towards their careers. And I think that's something I'd love to mirror in the screen space. We have so many examples of these breakout successes of projects, things like Irirangi, things like Inside. And I don't think we have enough of a pause to actually kind of look at those as case studies, like what worked, why were they special, what were some of the dynamics at play there that then can kind of inform things going forward. So, yeah, I think there's just a whole number of areas around music that we're going to increasingly lean to and look towards to learn from. And something interesting that we've recently been developing, we've got a sync licensing report that's going to be released soon up on our website that's looking at the complexities of why we haven't seen more New Zealand music baked into the local production that's come through, especially in the like premium or the high-end drama space. And this year we funded 2 big-scale dramas, both of whom have had the opportunity to come in and seek really well kind of designed additional money to go towards local music composition and music baked into the shows themselves. So again, we won't see the fruits of that labour until probably next year, but that's something, again, we're looking even further into, and that works at any scale of production. So yeah, we're really keen to see how that works and what more could be learned, because one of the key things that came out of the sync licensing report was there is a little bit of a lack of education or awareness on the New Zealand production side or producer side about how to do that well. It's quite a complex system and there's barriers to that, not just around funding. So yeah, quite excited about that.
I love the nerdiness of all this, I have to say. The Fold is brought to you by O-Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O-Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tamaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
So one thing which I think is a real tension in here, which I genuinely have no clue how you resolve it, but I think that, you know, everyone who's a participant in the sector has to at least think about it, is the top 7 platforms are all kind of messaging, user-generated content or some combination of them, Netflix aside, which has its own complexities around the paywall and how that interacts with your legislation. And they have all had various kinds of scandals around the content, which sits on those platforms, particularly as it pertains to young people. I'm thinking about the rise of Andrew Tate on TikTok and how that impacted very young kids, or Frances Horgan, the Instagram whistleblowers revelations around the impact it was having on young people over the world. And yet, if you're not there, if you don't consider that a brand safe environment, then you're just basically abdicating the audience. How do you sort of wrestle with that I don't know if it's a contradiction, but it's certainly a real tension around what actually goes on in these platforms and how it impacts audiences, and what by being there you are on some level, saying it's okay.
Yeah, this actually came up as one of the questions after we presented the youth research this morning. And to be honest, we're utterly grappling with it, as is everyone else. One of the points we made was just that, and you've just made it in terms of abdicating the audience. Like there is an ethical issue in terms of not being on there as well. If that is where in terms of research and evidence base, I think where we have approached it, or the ways that we've approached it, is just trying to be incredibly considerate about how we do that. So the examples of things like Every Voice Matter, because we're working with TikTok as a platform, we're trying to understand how to ensure the content finds its way to its audience. And I think we're just we are taking a measured approach in terms of how much funding is going onto those platforms. It's not a straight answer for you, but it's certainly one that we're grappling with. But it does feel like it's not enough to just put our heads in the sand and say we shouldn't be on it, full stop.
Yeah, and there is some of the people who make those arguments, there is an integrity to the argument, but there's also a vested interest, that suggests only fund local platforms irrespective of whether they reach audiences, only fund local productions irrespective of whether they reach those audiences.
But if I can actually add to that as well, like the children's strategy that we launched this year, so not the youth strategy, the children's strategy, we were very conscious of this issue, I think, around YouTube Kids as well. And the point that we wanted to make was actually we see the opportunity, and this works well in the kids because it's non-commercial, so kind of this idea of multiple kind of content sharing partnerships, etc., can work far easier there. I'm sort of aware of that. But it was about saying that we want it in both places. We want parents to know that actually it's on Prime Sky or it's on TVNZ Plus, and it's also on YouTube Kids, and it's about kind of choice and options as well. And I guess that's one way to kind of responsibly work in that realm.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the kids space, in some ways, it's simpler because of the lack of commercial imperative. And I do sometimes think when you transfer funding toward the user-generated content platforms, YouTubes, TikToks, Instagrams, and so on, A, those are wildly profitable platforms. B, they can be harder to make a living on than more traditional platforms. How do you sort of grapple with those kind of, on some level, conflicting North Stars?
Yeah, and I think and I will speak specifically to kids, but things like the understanding that we're geo-locking the content to New Zealand on YouTube Kids, I think, is a really important one. So it doesn't diminish the producer's ability to commercially sell that worldwide around the world. We're waiting and hoping for our next bluey opportunity, and that the way in which we're looking at the distribution strategy won't curtail that potential and opportunity. And I think the other thing that I bang on about it a lot, but we're sort of early days of having enough data to kind of be very kind of explicit about it. But I think the reality is that there's not a cannibalizing necessarily of audiences across those platforms either. And we've seen that a little bit with some of the multi-platform distribution of shows like The Hui and Tangata Pacifica going out across wider platforms than just TVNZ. And actually, in some instances, and Ahikaro is a great example of this with Whakaata Māori and TVNZ's content sharing arrangement, is that actually Whakaata Māori was seeing an increase in audiences coming to Ahikaro, potentially because there'd been a greater exposure and release on demand. So I think that, again, that myth of like trying to bust that you can't have it in those places because you lose revenue in one area or you lose audience share. I think the reality is you can be talking to different audience groups and you're incrementally growing the audience. That's certainly what we're trying to get more data around to demonstrate.
I mean, that's one of the the fascinating things about this kind of very postmodern era that we're living through, where what is content, what is marketing for the content, what is a satisfactory experience of it versus something which points you somewhere else. I think, that Ahikaro example suggests that actually just by making it more available, everyone who holds a piece of it actually benefits. So I want to shift now to talk a bit about the strategy that you unveiled at Sparta, which is like, I've written about it for the spin-off, but it was quite a strange situation where, you were basically sat in front of a room full of people, you'll know almost all of them, who have had a relationship with New Zealand On Air over a long period of time, and saying, so, hi, we've got like less than half as much money as we did last year, and the bit that's there for you is even smaller again proportionally. You've had a weird winter. Right? That's an odd message.
Yeah, it is an odd message. I think proportionately less, but not necessarily either. I guess my wero to the sector, or our wero to the sector, also says, what do the local platforms want to do alongside the wider international platforms in terms of their content going out as well? And I know that's not an easy discussion, and I know there's a massive amount of commerciality and issues with that, but I do I do think what we were trying to say to the room was it's undeniable now that we're going to have to do things differently. And yes, in a significantly reduced funding environment, we're going to have to prioritise some things over others. But I'm interested in what your kind of take on that was in terms of how you read it to the sector, because we kind of see a ton of opportunity in this space for local platforms as well as for producers.
Yeah, I mean...
Sorry, and just to add to that, given the fact that ANZPM, the ANZPM, is going to be growing the pot, as we understand it, growing the pot of public funding. It's trying to step up and out of us not just being seen as the major ecosystem there, it's actually the wider piece at play. And so suddenly, what are we doing differently alongside the new public media broadcaster and others?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was what was kind of most interesting about it, that there was this clarifying effect about what ANZPM's role would be. That's ANZPM, that's the merged entity that is going to control TVNZ and RNZ and have a bunch more money besides, and is going to have, I think if you did the math on it, from what Kate Slater, the TVNZ's Director of Content, said, anywhere up to $200 million of local commissioning budget, which is a very large increase on what's currently available, along with this new remit to reach audiences that aren't the quote unquote commercial demographics. It's all a lot. But I thought that New Zealand On Air's kind of conception of itself as it almost felt like where everything should begin in a way, and that the research should be the basis of where things go and what is and isn't working. And then this idea of development, and you pointed to the work with the Pan Asian Screen Collective and with the Pacific Island Screen Alliance on New Waves, and just this idea that it was that the actual amount that is available to make retail products, which is about sort of call it $30 million, is much smaller. But if you think of it as it's you go from being like Lion or DB to being a craft brewer, like this experimental lab, which ultimately should feed into a great many different places. And I found that quite an interesting and challenging thing, especially given that you came up with it in about 10 minutes in the scheme of things. And it almost felt like you and Cam felt kind of liberated from that, because historically it's been very hard to escape the sense that 3 and TVNZ just owned a very large amount of the funding for almost historic reasons. And there was never going to be a way to break that apart from a situation like this. It's
interesting you say that. In 10 minutes, yes, but actually I would say the New Zealand Media Fund review in 2020, because we'd had the seismic shift of the change to the funding structure that happened in 2017. The New Zealand Media Fund was born. This idea it was going platform agnostic. It was no longer entirely captured by linear. But actually the research...
Still, it was not,
Well, this is the point I think I'm trying to make. The point that the research showed that actually it didn't significantly change outputs or platforms or where the money was actually going. And so I think that set the train in motion of... Okay, so what are the pipeline issues? What are the systemic issues? Where are the pressure points? And we kept finding ourselves going back to, interestingly, back to our storytellers, to the very narrow doorways in which writers and creators could kind of walk through to then pitch their wares, to then get onto the platforms to get the content out. So. But you're right. I think this is an opportunity for us to move or accelerate into the direction that we had already been leaning towards, which was trying to actually go, what's our place in the whole ecosystem, not just as the primary funder based on the kind of quantum we get. Like these conversations we're having around the screen production grant at the moment, and there's massive advocacy and sort of oddly unison amongst the sector that the rules should be changed to allow for producers to access NZ On Air baseline funding along going into the screen production grant, which currently you're not allowed to quote-unquote double dip unless it's for children's and animation. That one change alone, I think, would transform the sector. Again, it just brings access to a much greater amount of pūtea. And if we can sit at the kind of epicentre of driving the writers and creators to build the projects up that may ultimately never get funded by us or could get funded by the ANZPM or Discovery or Prime Sky or Whakaata Māori, whatever that looks like, that's what we're really interested in. So that it feels like this is our kind of moment of doubling down on that thesis and pushing forward.
So I've kind of got a bit ahead of it, which is very typical of the scenario here. So do you want to just kind of explain that new idea about how you'll operate and how that interacts with that big known issue that was very much identified in the research, that is the foundational to the idea of ANZPAM itself, and has been, I think, an obsession of New Zealand On Air over the past couple of years, particularly. What the new strategy is and why you've gone in that direction.
Yeah, so the reality of where we're heading is that we're going from historically having about $80 million worth of contestable funding for scripted and factual only. So that's not for music, that's not for platforms funding. And that quantum is now going down to around $30 million. And historically, we've carved that pot up 50-50, where factual and scripted get half each. So in an environment where you've suddenly got 15 million for scripted and 15 million for factual, we no longer have the scale and volume to produce the scale of content that was going out before. So what we did was we kind of, when we got the news about the reduction in funding, this is if the legislation passes, we sat down and we retrenched and we started looking at what were the projects that we could sort of hand on heart look at and go, these sort of typify why we think we exist, why we should be funding them. Audiences have found them, they've meant something, they've gone on to travel and be picked up around the world, but they're hugely culturally specific, all those kind of variables, and there's always tons at play when we're looking at what we invest in. And invariably what we started to see was it actually wasn't that the scale of production was kind of interesting, that actually the projects that had kind of shot through and shot out had been able to have kind of deeper or richer development, or had gone through and been part of kind of key initiatives where we'd worked with industry bodies to bring in new voices coming through and things. So it's really just a crystallising of that. We are still retaining a level of contestable funding for production, but it's likely that we'll make key changes such as the number of funding rounds, the amount of applications people can put in, and a much greater onus on development, as we've talked about. And critically marketing and promotion, which is a challenging aspect of this conversation, because with reduced money, we're putting a stake in the ground to say we need to be more explicitly funding marketing and promotion out of our funding baseline alongside production funding. And of course, that's squeezing the pot tighter. We're using the children's strategy at the moment as our test balloon to kind of gauge. We've carved out quite a nominal amount, about 2 to 3% of the funding, of the production funding for children's content is going towards paid marketing and promotion to actually, alongside the platforms. That's the key thing here, is that the platforms are still expected, that they've got a horse in the race, they're expected to market and promote this content to their audiences, but we're trying to do an ancillary thing where we're additionally funding paid marketing and promotion to try and ensure we're reaching the eyeballs that we need to. So that'll be something that we're looking to roll out as well going on from next year.
That's historically been a bit of a complaint amongst some on the production or talent side, is that they'll pour their whole hearts into creating a product, and then the platform will just sort of put it out. And, whether that's through the time slot or the amount of marketing and promotional support, that it just will feel like it doesn't have the opportunity to become what it might. Is there anything in this new strategy that says we will kind of hold the platform to account on that? Like that, there isn't a guaranteed certain amount of future funding if there is a bit of a desultory response to actually holding the thing very tight and raising it right?
Yeah. The tricky thing that we've always found in this space is where the leverage is. So ultimately we fund the producer, we don't fund the platform. And so the only real kind of, I guess, sort of weight or leverage you can have is at the point in time in which the platform wants to get the project funding at the very beginning. So we did say at Sparta, we will be far more discerning, and we already are, but we will be looking very closely at the marketing campaigns and the commitment and the assets and things that the platforms are committing to with the projects that are coming into us for funding, and that will actually be a crucial thing as to how we prioritise one project. If there's two projects side by side and they look fantastic and they could equally be funded, but one platform has gone very clearly and said this is how and what we will do and what we will invest in, that's going to get funded over the other one. But I think it's still it's sort of early doors for us in terms of how we make that work. The other thing I want to add, though, as well, because the Aotearoa Screen Publicity Collective has done a phenomenal job of shining a light on how sort of broken that pipeline is when productions are being made and huge opportunities are being missed while things are being created, to just carve out time within production schedules and budgets to allow for amazing still shoots, things that are going to create all of the incredible assets. And it was really affirming to see that reflected back at us in the youth research as well, that actually it's the content that has got really strong collateral that's living and breathing on social media and building social currency that's getting talked about and driving kind of word of mouth and uptake. So I just think, yes, it's a difficult conversation, more money going towards it, but it's also just a no-brainer in terms of what the research is telling us.
Yeah, to make it and not have anyone see it is almost a bigger tragedy again. We've talked a lot about, we've used a lot of acronyms and a lot about the sort of systems and processes, and that's a natural thing. A, there's government money involved, and B, it's a very complex area. But I'd love it if you'd talk for a minute about some projects that feel like they represent a vision of where this thing might go, particularly for New Zealand On Air as it adjusts to this new environment that where you can say, okay, more like this.
And I'm going to use Extremely Online again, actually, because the Shit You Should Care About team, I was listening to Lucy on an interview where she talked about what the New Zealand On Air funding had meant for the team, which was that they had already done all of the heavy lifting of building up their amazing community, but they saw an opportunity where they could come in to access the funding under the Youth RFP to create this kind of, relatively good-sized and scaled project that allowed them to essentially quit their jobs, was the way I sort of heard her phrase it. So it allowed them to go, we're going to have a crack at this and give this a go. And to date, they're yet to come back in for funding for New Zealand On Air. But what, to me, that kind of showed, and it goes back to us talking about the kind of incubator idea, it was like, where did that funding have the highest impact that enabled a production company, producer, storyteller to do something that probably would have been too risky, too difficult to capitalise on or invest in themselves, but yet delivers to public media outcomes as well. And I think another good example was Wrestler with the self-help web series, which is really brilliant. And for them, I think it was an early foray for them into scripted that they hadn't really done before, and wouldn't necessarily have been something as a commercial organisation they could easily invest in or kind of get the writers' table together and do that. And so their ability to come in and get that funding proof points the ability for them to do it, and it's an amazing calling card. And so that feels like that's going to open up and create greater opportunities, both for kind of our funding going forward, but I'm sure other areas that are in their commercial space as well. So I think that area we're really interested in is kind of the high impact area. What does that look like?
In terms of the different audiences that are missing, what part of the reason you've gone hard into research is because that old period where you could on some level rely on Nielsen to or radio surveys to tell you a story that you're pretty confident in about audience. At the very least, it was all there was in terms of distribution. Especially thinking about the sort of the underserved audiences. How confident are you in both the research that you have and particularly this new suite of kind of always-on analytics that you're building out and encouraging people to come in for? They're not sure whether they're going to actually do it because everyone wants to know, but no one wants their work marked in public kind of thing. But obviously that's incredibly important to know, or to be as confident as you can be that you're meeting those Māori, Pacific, particularly Pan-Asian. I always think that's, in terms of the scale of that audience versus how it's served, that is really, really one that often gets missed. How will you know? And do you feel like you have the tools to know that you're going to get them?
I really wish I could sub our audience and media strategist Kat Goodwin into this answer, because I don't think I will do it as much justice as she will. And the tool that you're referencing is a data tagging tool that we have piloted under the Public Interest Journalism Fund, so that all our funded content under that fund, it's a requirement of the platform and producer that they tag the content, so that we're getting a comparative view across everything we've funded under public interest journalism of like, what are viewers, what are we seeing in terms of views across all of the populace, and time spent with that content as well, and some demographics that draw into regional and things, but it's not down to specificity of the demographics of the individuals watching the content. So we're not getting a clear line of sight on that as yet. So I think that's still something that we're absolutely grappling with, as is everyone, I think, around, and it's so important for us because obviously it's not just about reach for New Zealand On Air, it's about if that content was for a targeted community, did that reach them and did it have an impact?
So finally, there's, and I feel like this has been really thick in the conversation, but there's this kind of, duality where on some level the potential and the possibility of this era is enormous and kaleidoscopic, but there is also so much that we don't know, cannot know. In your heart of hearts, are you confident this is winnable? That, for ANZPAM with its kind of newly monster budget that's also like, about the cost of, a couple of episodes of Lord of the Rings, that say we're looking back from the end of the decade, that this community has been able to make content which can win a battle for attention, on these motu in a truly globalized market?
It's not a chill question.
Yeah, well, it's the last one, so.
Yeah, we define winnable. I guess you just sort of did. I am hopeful, and I say that because I think, what the vagaries of this is like, the sector, the changes in media consumption, the sort of appearing and disappearing platforms. I feel like I keep going back to, and why I'm so excited about the new strategy and where we're heading is it's about us. It's about our storytellers. Like, if we can just be absolutely hot shit about ensuring that the storytellers coming through, from kids all the way up through, that we're building an ecosystem and an environment where they're going to want to tell stories as the first thing, and then they're going to be supported to do that because they're going to be the ones that know how to make it for the platforms that we don't even know about yet that will come through. So I think if we keep our eyes on our amazing taonga, like our storytellers and their skills and their development and their ability to not have barriers to accessing the funding, then I totally think it's winnable.
I buy that, honestly. Not an easy question, but yeah, I mean, if you focus on the audiences and the people who want to reach them, and then everything else is contestable, it's going to be destabilizing, but it feels like the best shot. Hey, thanks so much for coming on The Fold, Amie.
Thanks, Duncan. Can I take 5 seconds to just say, for this insanely geeky podcast, just how grateful I personally am, because I feel like it informs the work, and it's brilliant, and you're doing a great job, even if your questions are really long.
Well, they are really long, eh? I often skip through the fold and I'm like, hey, man, bro, you're still talking. It's a nightmare. You need to we've got Te cracking up over there. He knows. But I feel like he needs to be able to electrocute me or something. Anyway, I'm doing it again. Thank you. Ka kite.
The Fold was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network. It was hosted by Duncan Grieve, produced by Te Butler, and series production by Jane Yee.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.